No? Nobody knows? Current CEO of IBM? No? You guys got to start reading American newspaper. It's Jeannie Romanek. And Jeannie just this week, she was announced to be the third female got accepted to Augusta Master Club. I know we have a lot of golfers here, so she's the third person. I know I forgot the first two used to be the Secretary of the State, Condoleezza Rice. I forgot the other one. And also, the reason I mentioned Jeannie's name is back in 1992, IBM was in big trouble. IBM, nobody's buying the mainframe computer, so IBM want to start a business. So today, IBM's business is about 65 billion. And back then, it was very tiny. So Ed was one of the 20 vice presidents back then, and they were trying to jumpstart the consulting service. So Jeannie Romanek was the other. So Ed just has CEO with American Favorite Chicken, and just has a lot of experience. So, and one thing I admire Ed is he is always there to help people. Whenever I need help, doesn't matter if it's English tuning or I got a strategic thing I want to ask him, he's always there. Right now, he's helping another young person how to start another business. So he's basically providing a free consulting to people. So this is, without further ado, let's give Ed Brooks a big welcome.
Thank you, Jimmy. Jimmy talks like it was just yesterday all this happened, but we've known each other really much longer than before he worked with me, and since then we've networked quite a bit. And when I agreed to speak today, he's kept me very well informed about what's going on. And last week he waited to give me the bad news. I had an email from Jimmy that says, Ed, bad news. I know you quit wearing suits a while ago, but we like to wear a suit and tie. And I retired in 09 from all work. And when I retired in 09, I gave my son 24 suits. Luckily, we wore the same size. Now, I kept 2. And here's what's happened in 5 years, and I noticed when I tried them on yesterday. The waists have gotten smaller, and the necks of the shirts don't fit anymore. 5 years in a closet not being used does that to suits. So, Jimmy, can I take my tie off?
Yeah.
Thanks. So, I haven't worn a suit since I quit in 09. And today I just had a sport coat on. I did disobey Jimmy a little bit. But I did try with the tie, but this shirt just didn't like it. Hey, listen, today I'll take some time to chat with you, not on technology, but on the things I've underlined there, which is leadership and upwards mobility. First, a question. Eliminate anyone in this room that's retired that doesn't work. Is there anyone in this room that does not have a job? Raise your hand. Does not have a job. Okay, there's very few. That's good. Now, I'm looking at this table. All you guys have a job, or several of you don't? Okay. Well, the target for my presentation is really towards those of you that have a job, and it's very relevant to those of you that will get a job. Those of you that are retired, you can just forget what I'm talking about because you probably don't care anyway. Let me tell you what my objectives are today. See if this works. Okay. I have basically 3 objectives. First, I want to just increase your awareness of what makes a difference as you move from the front lines to the executive suites. Does that make sense to you? The front lines to the executive suites. Now, Jimmy said I went from engineer to vice president. Big deal. There's 1,600 vice presidents at IBM. There's 400,000 employees, but it's a pretty high, lofty position. There's about 8 levels in between front line to vice president at IBM. Way too many. But that's what it was when I became a vice president. But what makes a difference to get you from the front lines to vice president or above, CEO, if you will? I'd like also as an objective to make you more curious about your business environment. And this whole word curiosity I'm going to talk about a little bit. That's key in getting ahead. And then finally, start you thinking about your personal capabilities. Our prior speaker, Mr. Farid Tan, he spoke about your strengths and your weaknesses. If you're not thinking about this and you're in your career, you're kind of stuck in the middle as far as I'm concerned, because if you're not thinking about that, you won't get ahead if you're not improving your weaknesses. Okay, here's my chronology, if you will. I got an electrical engineering degree at Penn State University. My first job was with Pratt & Whitney Aircraft. It lasted just a few months. I was a rocket scientist, what I always wanted to be. I found out I didn't like it. And I took a job immediately with a company called RCA, Radio Corporation of America. Very, very small part of it still exists today. But back then, they had a whole division that competed directly against IBM with lookalike mainframes. And so I became a design engineer there. I really loved pure engineering. And so that's what I did. However, RCA did not do well in the market. IBM pretty well clobbered them. So I decided to go with the winner. And I took an engineering position at IBM, and then I moved up the ladder at IBM. And you can see the positions I held from engineer to sales associate to sales manager. And it says branch manager, but I held 3 different branch manager positions. I was a kind of a fix-it guy. I was identified early that I developed people well, and I could turn problem situations around. So there were 3 different branches in Los Angeles, California that were not working well. And I went from one to the next to the next. So that position, I really had 3 of those. Then I made director. And then I want to tell you a little bit of the story here about this VP of consulting in red up there. What happened, Jimmy mentioned that in the early 90s, it was actually from the mid-80s through the early 90s. Anyone here, probably most of you don't even remember this, so this is a history lesson. IBM stock dropped to 42 from about $250 to $42. And on the picture of Fortune magazine, there was a mainframe with an arrow pointing to a dinosaur. That basically they were predicting IBM was going to go out of business. The chairman of the board was a fellow by the name of John Akers, was not very popular. They fired him, brought in an outsider, the first outside chairman at IBM in the history of the company. And IBM was started in 1915, so it's been around a long time. And Mr. Gerstner came from Reynolds and American Express. He was CEOs of both of those firms before IBM. Before that, he was head of McKinsey & Company, the consulting firm. And he did a lot of studies to decide what needed to change at IBM, and one of them was, IBM used to be the trusted advisor for technology to all CEOs. But in the 80s, that trusted advisor relationship moved to the accounting, or to the consulting firms. You remember Anderson Consulting, Boston Consulting Group, Price Waterhouse, KPMG. They had the influence at the CEO level that IBM no longer did. And he thought the best way to combat this was to develop IBM's own management consulting firm. He selected 25, I think Jimmy said 20, it was actually 25 executives at IBM to start a new company. I was lucky to be one of those. I think one of the key reasons I got selected was I had just done a mid-career MBA. And I'd held these 3 branch managers' jobs, so they knew I was a very capable executive. So they took 25 of us and then said, we're going to hire 25 consultants from the outside. You folks, 50 people will start a company. Our first year in business, we did $4 million in revenue. I don't know if it covered payroll, because these were really highly paid people. The next year, we did $40 million. The year after that, we did $400 million. Jimmy talked about $60 billion today. Well, that includes a lot of services. This was just management consulting. So that was a real opportunity for me to use my MBA and to grow very significantly as an executive. The fun about consulting, for those of you that may be considering that or in it, is what I loved about it was going from one client issue to another client issue and helping them resolve these issues. It's very, very satisfying to do that. However, I got to tell you, the travel kills you. Now, one of those other 25 executives was Jenny Rometty, who's the current CEO of IBM. And so you can kind of tell where IBM wants its leadership to come from. They want it to come from that part of the business called services, because hardware is commoditized, software isn't yet, but it's getting close, and where you can really differentiate yourself is in services. So I retired as a VP in the consulting business. I focused mostly on the retail industry, although I did projects with Shell Oil and British Petroleum. I did a project with Delta Airlines, so I wasn't totally in retail. I took a job with a company called AFC, America's Favorite Chicken. They own Cinnabon, Popeye's Fried Chicken, Church's Fried Chicken. We had a couple other concepts at the time, Seattle's Best Coffee, Chesapeake Bagel Bakeries. And I started there as a CIO. I moved up to COO of what they called management services. In a multi-brand organization like that, it doesn't make sense that each one of those brands has their own accounting department, their own IT department, their own legal department, their own personnel department. So what we did is we consolidated all of that, called it management services, and I was the chief operating officer for that division. Then, when I left them, they went public. I had a lot of options, it was fun. I took a job as CEO of a hardware manufacturing company in Orange County, California. I commuted from here to Orange County. Had an apartment in Orange County. My wife said, "You've lost it," which I probably did. However, I really wanted the CEO position to know what it was like. It was something I had striven for all my life. And that business did very, very well. It was very profitable. We tried to branch out in about the year 2000. Now, a technology company trying to branch out and do new things in the year 2000 was not a good thing to do. We were very quickly undercapitalized, the technology bust hit, and we went bankrupt. I was just about ready to quit when a good friend of mine who ran this company called Cornerstone, which was an IBM reseller, asked me if I would join his firm and help him. And I worked there for another 6 or 7 years as his sales and marketing guy. For me, it was a semi-retirement job. I played golf with him every weekend. Today, I played bridge with him. Yesterday and the day before, we're good friends. He sold the company ultimately, but it was a lot of fun working with him, growing that business from about 30 million to about 75 million. He didn't want it to get very big. It could have been 3 or 4 times that if he wanted it to be, which made it a little difficult to work with him. Now, where you see on that chart the word sales manager, from that point on, I became responsible to develop managers and hire managers and hire executives at some of those higher levels. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, are some of the things that I learned during that process. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about first, and you know, the 2 prior speakers mentioned some of these things. It's really great to hear the continuity. My personal business priorities always have been, first and number 1, achieve outstanding business results. If you don't, you may not get to keep your job. So that's got to be number 1. Number 2, I always want to continuously improve my performance. If I did great last year, I want to do better this year. Keep raising the bar. It's why I wanted promotions. Now, you can do this in a lot of companies without ever getting a promotion into management. I have my best friend in Pennsylvania. When I left my sales job in Pennsylvania, we were partners. We've compared our salaries every year since I left. And he is a professional salesman. It took me 10 years in management to exceed his income. So there's a career there if you just want to be a professional salesperson or a professional consultant as opposed to an executive. Success doesn't always mean executive is my point. And then that last thing is I always want to continuously learn. Now, these were my personal goals. It was interesting to hear the other 2 speakers bring up these items as well. Okay, let's talk about the topic that I'm here to talk about, which is difference makers. Now, what is a difference maker? This is my definition, by the way. The personal skills, talents, attributes, assets, or whatever you want to call them, that set you apart from your colleagues. I call them distinguishable skills, distinguishable abilities. And I'm here to submit to you that these can be observed, and very many of them can be learned. Some of it has to be a little innate, but very much of it can be learned. Now, also, I want to give you a disclaimer. I'm not a workplace psychologist. I'm here strictly speaking from experience. The other thing is, some of my experiences on this particular topic come from IBM, because an IBM and GE are the two top-ranked companies into the 2000s in succession planning. Everyone understand what that means, succession planning? That means they knew Ginny Rometty was going to be CEO caliber executive long before she became CEO. They identified very early who's going to succeed who and who can succeed who. And so some of these difference makers come right out of how IBM identifies those that can be division leaders and those that can be corporate leaders. Okay, now let's set the table here a little bit and talk about the business environment. And let's take an executive view. If you're selecting candidates for positions, management and executive positions, what I say up there is there's many, many candidates for few openings. That's the way the economy is today. And secondly, most, if not all, of the candidates are very well qualified. They all going to have solid educational backgrounds. They all have solid track records. And they have relevant experience. So how do you decide which one to select? Now let me just put one selection criteria aside that you can't do much about, and I call it political. My father owns a company. Gee, I guess that person's going to get the job. So let's put those aside. But all things being equal, like I just described, how do you select that individual? And that's why I want to talk about difference makers. Now, this description of the environment has been this way for at least the last decade or 2 decades. But the recession of '09 has just made this much more pervasive. Worldwide, I mean, it's just very pervasive, this situation. So I'm going to go through 5 difference makers in this presentation for the time frame we have, but I've got another 7 or 8 at the end of the presentation. So Jimmy, these will be available on the website, so you can read through them when you see it. But these 5 I thought were probably the most relevant. This one to me is the building block. I think it's almost the most important one, and it's probably the one that's most innate in all the others. If you don't have a little bit of this in your head, it's very hard to learn to become this way. It's called intellectual curiosity. And it's the ability, or the need to know more, to want to learn. You see the word business? I pressed 2 buttons at once. Okay, let me try this. See that word business right there? You can substitute for that word strategy, problem, challenge. You can substitute in there personal strategy, personal problems, personal challenge. You can substitute in there client strategy, client problems. An intellectually curious person does that. Now, if you have to learn this, and I had to, by the way, although I always have been an avid reader, so that's, I think, part of this. And if you do get good grades in school and you're a high achiever, you usually already have a good bit of this. But if you try to learn it as you go through your first job, second job, third job, you've got to learn to do it without being a nag and asking a lot of silly questions. So use your head about this one. When I was with the consulting group, when we started that company, this was the #1 criteria for hiring a consultant. You cannot be a good consultant if you don't have intellectual curiosity. It just isn't going to work. This is a good one. By the way, I just have to say, this is one that Jimmy Koo is really good at. And I call it maze bright. Maze coming from the Pavlovian labyrinth, and that some people get through it quickly, some people never get through it. But in business, what Maze Bright means is getting through an organization or a bunch of related companies quickly to find the answer that you're looking for. And people do this, and other people don't. And usually the people that don't do it well stay in the front lines and don't move along very quickly. The people that do it well bring high value. A client has an issue. We need to get someone from out of town to help. The person that's Maze Bright will find someone from out of town to help very quickly. Problem solved faster. Client value and appreciation high. So people that are Maze Bright are really get value quickly in the business. Now, Jimmy and I have talked about this, so I refer to these things. I'm just, he knows what I'm going to say. We've had many breakfasts and lunches over these topics. We argue, we discuss, and that sort of thing. Being Maze Bright usually is a result of someone that networks well, by the way. Because the way you learn organizations and complex interrelationships with companies is you're networking with these companies, and you know who has the answers to what questions and where they're located. And I didn't put it up on this slide, but networking is definitely part of this deal. Now, Maze Bright is probably, of all these difference makers I'm talking about, is the most interesting to me, because as a manager, I seek these people out in my organization. They can be great assets to you. And again, this can be learned. If you are intellectually curious, you will learn this. It's also experiential. It can be learned that way. A little slower, experiential. Okay, I have to say something on this one. Okay, yes, I'm preaching to the choir. You know you've got to be a multitasker. But here's the kind of multitasker you do not want to be. Don't bother me, I'm balancing too many things. That's somebody that's overwhelmed. Yes, they're multitasking, but they're preoccupied with their multitasking. An executive candidate multitasks in the way that I described it. They multitask with great focus. They move from one task to the next. And whatever task they're on, they're 100% focused at that moment in time. And they can move rapidly from one task to the next. And it appears to be comfortable and easy for them when they make these transitions. Now, my first executive job, and I know the day in the life of an executive is a drill they put you through at IBM Management School. And I know it's hectic, but I never realized it until I was in it. How dramatic the change is from one 5-minute interval to the next 5-minute interval. The first 5-minute interval, I may be speaking to one of my managers about the strategy that they're going to use with a particular client. We're done with that, my phone's ringing, and it's a client telling me that I have to remove all personnel assigned to his account because they stink. And then 5 minutes later, I have an employee walk into my office and say that their spouse was just diagnosed with a bad disease. Yeah, I've got a million things. My boss wants something by 4 o'clock that afternoon. Now, you have to move from these things. You cannot be, when that employee comes in and talks to you about their spouse, you can't be thinking about the client that just told you to fire everyone on the account. You better be thinking about that employee, their spouse, their family. How can you help? 100%. So when I talk about multitasking, that's what I'm talking about. Don't bother me. I'm balancing too many things. I'm spinning too many plates. Have you ever heard that phrase, spinning plates? It used to be the old sideshow. So that's what I mean when I say multitasking. Okay, this is a very good one. Q-sense. Q-sense is basically understanding the intent without asking a lot of questions. Now, here are the subtleties to Q-sense that I think are very appropriate for us. Look at that first sub-bullet where it says, sort out satire, sarcasm, humor, emotion, body language. I used to have a boss, he used to tell me, Ed, I love that you work for me. You know why? I knew what he was going to say before he said it. And when he told me what he needed to do, I knew when it had to be done. I knew the detail it had to be in. And I knew the format it had to be submitted in. Ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. So good Q sense will make you a very, very good asset as an employee, because the boss doesn't have to spend time saying, Jimmy, I need it on 8.5 by 11 paper. I need it typed. I want a computer file with it. Put it on a diskette and hand it to me by 4 o'clock today. Etc., etc. So Q-Sense now, here's the thing. Jimmy and I talked about this. I think when there is a language and a culture difference, Q-Sense becomes difficult. And this is one that's on the list for succession planning on those difference makers that take you from, this one here may take you from, vice president to CEO. You don't have to have it maybe to get to first line management and junior executive. But if you want to go as far as you can, this is one of those that will get you there. Let me talk about Q-Sense one more. There's another aspect to this. One of my observations on the best executives I've ever worked with, this is an observation, they ask the best questions. And I always wondered why, and there's books written about this, by the way. On this whole topic, there's books written about. There's books written about body language. There's books written about phrases and what they really mean. For instance, Jimmy, my friend, what I'd like to tell you today, guess what? When I say that phrase, my friend, it means everything but. Beware of that phrase. The books will tell you all of this stuff. There's a book called Asking Just the Right Questions, written by a professor where I got my MBA at Pepperdine University. It's an okay book. It's an okay book. But what I learned is Q-Sense is why good executives ask excellent questions. They're really into what you're saying. They're reading your body language. They're understanding your intent when you use offhanded comments or humor or satire. And they can drill underneath that very quickly and ask good questions. So good Q-Sense usually leads to the ability for you to ask better questions. Good Q-Sense, if Jimmy says, Ed, I want you to work on this project, my Q-Sense can tell me enough. I don't have to ask those first 4 questions. I know to ask just the right question, because my Q-Sense answers most of what I need to know, because I'm reading him well. So that's a pretty important one, Q-Sense. And it's not one that comes naturally for a lot of people. But you can read a lot about it. And as you go along in business and move up in business, you really should educate yourself. Okay, if this wasn't on the list, I know you would have beat me up, because communication is always part of good leadership, and it's a great difference maker. And when I say communications, you've got to think about it different than you probably ever thought about it. For instance, I start a list there. One on few, one on many. Today for me, I'm communicating one on many. Formal, informal. I call this formal communications. If I was walking around amongst you and sitting at a table and moving around, it would be more informal. And then various venues. And you don't think about that too often. Let me just give you an anecdotal story. When I got my first junior executive job at IBM, and I've been to sales school where I'm videotape making all sorts of presentations. I've taken speech in college. I've taken Dale Carnegie. I've done a lot of things to help me become a good communicator. When I got my first junior executive job at IBM, I was told, you're going to go spend a week in New York City with a company called Communispond. I said, I don't want to go. I'm a good speaker. I can put a presentation together with the best of them. Ed, you don't understand. You don't get the job unless you go to this. Every IBM executive from this level above goes to Communispond. Okay, if I have to, I'll go. It was pretty much the first day or two, the kind of stuff I knew. And all of a sudden, we get into this various venue thing. And one of them was, how do you run a press conference? I'm a junior executive. I hadn't even thought about having a press conference. But guess what? As you go on up into the organization, you don't know when one's going to happen. So back in '08, I happened to be president of my golf club. And when the recession hit, resignations start flying in. Every one of the golf club was afraid there was going to be an assessment to keep the club open. And I had to hold a meeting with all the membership. This was a very adversarial meeting. It's like there were 300 reporters in the room wanting to just take me out. I had to run it like a press conference. Questions from the floor. You never point in a press conference. It's open hand. You have a question. You always repeat the question. You never answer it without repeating it. The reason is you've got to think about your answer. Second reason is for the benefit of the audience, so they know what the question is, because we weren't mic'd up. It was just not a good meeting. But I had to call on all those skills. When I was president of the company in California, we were listed on the NASDAQ. And we had our call with the analysts, just like all publicly traded companies do. And from time to time, that was like running a press conference. So some of those skills I didn't have and didn't think I needed sure came in handy later. Think about your communication skills. It's something that you should, in every job, learn a new communication skill. You almost have to be good enough on the one-on-one and the one-on-few to get to the next job to start with. You can learn these things in college and that sort of thing. So, but when I talk about continuously learning, I've always done this with speaking. And if you're not a good communicator, it's going to be tough to get too far ahead. It's one of the building blocks, I think, for high achievement. Okay, the next one I think is the one that Jimmy and I spent a lot of time on. I call it culturally adaptable. And it's the ability to rapidly grasp the culture of a company or a country and begin to act such as you understand the norms, the humor, and the vernacular, and you're part of it. Now, I'm going to tell an anecdote here because it really tells a story, because I have analyzed this. In the mid-1980s, I was a national manager for IBM in the retail industry. And I was called by an executive and said, Ed, we have two high-rising candidates in Japan, in IBM Japan, they've been identified as future executive leaders of IBM Japan. We want them to come to the U.S. and spend a year learning and being developed. Could you take these two young men? I said, glad to. So, two gentlemen from the same organization, IBM Japan, joined me in Raleigh, North Carolina, and worked for me for a year. And I had a twofold job, basically. They came to work for me. They wanted to learn about the retail industry, both domestically, U.S. and internationally. And they wanted to learn how to be an executive or a high-level manager. Now, I watched these two very carefully for the year they were with me. One was very, very successful. One was not. And I want to tell you what I observed. I observed that they go through two stages. First stage is gain acceptance. I think that's up there. And gain acceptance is usually pretty easy. People want you to become part of it. You're usually invited to meetings and social gatherings and that sort of thing. The more difficult tier to get to is become included. And the one gentleman from Japan never really got included. The other gentleman did. And the fellow that got to that next tier and became included, he volunteered for a lot of stuff. I mean, they would sit in my staff meetings, and I would say, we need to research something. I'll research that and have a report for you next week. Oh, really? Tatsuhiko? That was his name. You could do that? Of course. He probably worked all weekend on it, poor guy. But his knowledge ramped up quickly. Confidence in this gentleman came along quickly. We began to ask him for his opinion. We began to ask him, do you mind making a presentation on this topic to a different group, Tatsuhiko? The other gentleman was very quiet. Didn't bother him that he wasn't included. Okay, here's when I knew that this gentleman had really grasped being included. I called a national conference for all of the leaders in IBM worldwide in the retail industry. So we had a room with about as many people as we have here, 40 or 50. And, 70? Okay, about this size, 70 is good. And I asked, as I kicked the meeting off, I asked my staff to introduce themselves, and it included these two Japanese assignees. And the first Japanese assignee introduced himself. I mean, just what you might do. Hi, I'm so-so, I'm from Japan. I'm here working with Ed. I'm having a good time and learning a lot, and sat down. Then two other of my staff introduced themselves. It just so happened they were both named Bruce. So one fellow stands up, I'm Bruce so-and-so, I do this, I do that, and he sits down. The other guy stands, I'm Bruce so-and-so, then it's Tatsuhiko. Tatsuhiko stands up, I'm Tatsuhiko Nagai from Japan. My name, Tatsuhiko, means Dragon Man. I'm not really a dragon. Everyone laughed. And he talked about himself. And then he said, but you can just call me Bruce. And sat down. And that's the reaction he got. And I tucked this away. I said, no. And the next week, that young man got phone calls worldwide asking for his insights on things. It's just amazing, but sense of humor is what I wanted to point out. And he understood how to make humor and be accepted and included. So this is a trait, an attribute that you can learn. It's one that you need to really look at and study. I had a year to do it, never thought about it much till I had two young men assigned to me from another country. I tried very, very hard with a gentleman that didn't quite get across the line. I don't think he wanted to accept the American culture, which is kind of what he had to do to be included in the mix. The other fellow came at it aggressively, and he had already given it thought, I could tell. So, thank you. So, cultural adaptability is a very good attribute to have. Now, I want to tell one other anecdote. When I left IBM and took the job with AFC, the CIO fraternity in Atlanta is pretty tight. And we breakfast together, lunch together when I had that position. I was very lucky to have been given pretty much a blank check in that job. Very few CIOs get a blank check. So I'm installing new technology and doing things on the web in 1995 when the web was just becoming available to people, and I was pretty popular, and a company came after me to hire me. And I knew this company, their executives were all golfers, and I'm a golfer. Where's Joe? Joe's a golfer. And Joe, would you agree that on the golf course, the true you comes forward? Because it's a humbling experience to golf. True? Now, I played golf with 3 executives from that company. And about halfway through, I said, I don't like this culture. I will not adapt to this culture. So cultural adaptability doesn't mean you must always adapt, but it means be conscious of it, and where you find a place you love to be, then adapt. I never took that job. I never spoke to those fellas again. I had a great time golfing because I enjoy golf. But what I saw from them told me, and the questions they asked me and the way they asked them to me, these weren't people that like people in my mind. People to them look like tools. You're just a means to an end. So I rejected that culture. Luckily, before I ever took the job. Okay, let me just summarize. I have 3 summary points and then a recommendation. Understand the difference makers distinguish you from one candidate to the next. They become distinguishable characteristics. And some of them have a little bit of a requirement for some innate ability, but most of this can be learned. Now, you can kind of take inventory by doing a self-analysis, kind of rate yourself, and how am I at these things? Those of you that work probably get annual performance reviews. And I would suggest outside the annual performance review, you step in the office and ask your boss, I don't care what level you're at, whether you're reporting to a board of directors, and say, can we talk about me? What do I do that pleases you? What do I do that frustrates you? You'll learn more in that evaluation than the annual performance evaluation the company requires. Because now you're targeting the people that you have to satisfy to become successful. So that personal inventory that was talked about earlier, I fully agree with that. Now, here's the recommendation, which is the last bullet on the chart. When you write your resume and you write your results, all resumes ought to be results driven. You should relate your difference makers to those results. At the bottom of the resume is your education. All of your resume is your experience. When you write results, you can say, I adapted quickly to this new company and achieved these results in less than 1 year. Wow, I adapted quickly. Okay? By making multiple successful presentations in different venues, one on few and one on many, I sold, or I presented, or I got people to commit to do something, whatever your result is. So you can take these difference makers and just litter your resume with them. That's my recommendation to you. Now, so I'm kind of done, but just so you know what else is in here, I'll just quickly go through. Deadline sensitive, accountable, team player, high energy level, positive enthusiasm, and decisiveness. I think that's, executive perspective, the ability to see things from above your job. That's it. So those are in there, but just for time, Jimmy said, I think you're only going to get through about 5 of these, which is what we got through. Any questions before I leave the podium? Okay, oh wait, one question over here.
What is your handicap?
It's not a difference maker, I'll tell you that. It was low until I got old.